4% rule is probably the single most repeated piece of advice in all of personal finance. It shows up in retirement calculators, gets quoted by financial advisors, gets referenced in books and articles and YouTube videos, and it has become the de facto planning standard for how much you can safely withdraw from an investment portfolio each year. And for a specific type of retiree, planning a specific length of retirement, it is a defensible starting point. But here's the problem. If you are planning to retire before age 65, in your mid-40s, your 50s, or your early 60s, the 4% rule was not designed for you. And when you apply the actual back-tested research to a retirement horizon of 40 to 50 years, the number that comes back is dramatically different from what most people have been told. Here is what the historical data produces for a 50-year retirement: a 68% failure rate. That means, in the back-tested record, more than 2 out of every 3 early retirees who used a 4% withdrawal rate, adjusting for inflation each year, ran out of money before their retirement was done. Now, I want to be precise about something before we go any further. This video is not about fear. I'm not going to tell you that early retirement is impossible, or that you need to keep working until 65, or that everything you have planned is wrong. That would be entirely the wrong conclusion to draw from this data. And frankly, that kind of fear-first framing is the least useful thing I could offer you here. What this video is going to do is show you 3 things: why the 4% rule was never calibrated for early retirement, what the back-tested research actually shows about the right withdrawal rate for retirement horizons of 40 to 50 years, and how to build a practical spending framework around a number that genuinely holds up, without turning your retirement into a decades-long exercise in financial anxiety. Because here is what I care about. I want someone who has spent years saving and investing and making patient, disciplined decisions to walk into early retirement with a plan that is truly robust. I do not want one that looks solid on a spreadsheet and quietly collapses somewhere around year 35. If you are planning to retire before 65, or if you are already in early retirement and you're not fully confident in the numbers underneath your strategy, this is the video for you. Let's start at the beginning, because the 4% rule has a very precise origin, a very precise definition, and a very precise set of conditions attached to it. And most of the people who quote it have never actually engaged with those conditions. William Bengen published his original research in 1994. And here's the key. He was not trying to find the highest withdrawal rate a retiree could sustain. He was trying to find the lowest rate at which a retiree would not run out of money. Across every historical 30-year period, he could find reliable data for. That is the definition of safe in this context. And keep in mind, it does not mean most likely to succeed. It means has never failed across any historical 30-year window. Those are transitionally and meaningfully different claims. The time window was 30 years, not 35, not 40, not 50, 30 years, which, if you're retiring at 65 and planning to age 95, is a reasonable and appropriate horizon. But if you are retiring at 55, that same 30-year window expires when you are 85. If you are retiring at 45, it runs out when you are 75, which is nowhere near the end of most early retirees' realistic planning horizon, especially given current longevity trends. Now, Bengen was working with data going back to 1926, which gave him roughly 35 distinct 30-year historical windows to test. And his finding was that a portfolio of approximately 50% stocks and 50% bonds could sustain a 4% initial withdrawal, adjusted upward for inflation each year, across every single one of those windows without the portfolio reaching zero. That is a genuinely powerful result. It is why the rule has earned the credibility it has. It held up through the Great Depression. It held up through the stagflation and market turbulence of the 1970s. It held up through every significant historical stress in that dataset. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we go through this. The 4% rule is a conditional claim. It is not a universal truth. It holds under specific conditions: a 30-year retirement, a specific portfolio allocation, and a historical data set built on market behavior from the early 20th century through the early 1990s. The moment you change those conditions, the safe withdrawal rate changes with them. And for early retirees, by definition, the most critical of those conditions, the retirement horizon, is completely different. Here's what I think most conversations about early retirement withdrawal rates get fundamentally wrong. They treat a 40-year or 50-year retirement as though it is simply an extended version of the 30-year problem. More years, same underlying math, slightly more conservative approach. That framing misses something important about how risk actually compounds over time. The structure of the risk changes when you extend the horizon. And it changes in ways that are consequential at the center of the problem, not just at the margins. Let me make this concrete with some real numbers. Imagine you are 52 years old and you have built a $2 million portfolio through decades of disciplined saving and consistent investing. You want to retire at 55. At 4%, you are looking at an initial withdrawal of $80,000 in year one, adjusted upward for inflation every year after that. Across a 30-year retirement, research by Wade Pfau, Michael Kitches, and David Blanchett consistently shows that a 4% withdrawal rate has historically succeeded in approximately 95% of scenarios. That is the number that gets quoted. That is where the confidence in the rule comes from. But you are not planning a 30-year retirement. You are planning a 40-year retirement. And the difference between those two horizons is not a 33% increase in risk. It is a structurally different probability picture. Here's what the data shows. Extend the retirement horizon from 30 to 40 years, and the historical success rate for a 4% withdrawal rate drops to somewhere between 70 and 80%, depending on asset allocation and which backtested data set you are drawing from. Push that horizon to 50 years, which is exactly where you land if you retire at 45, and the historical success rate falls to approximately 32%. That is the 68% failure rate in this video's title. And I want to be precise about what that means. It is not a worst-case stress test built on pessimistic assumptions. It is the empirical result when you apply a 4% withdrawal rate to every 50-year period in the historical backtested record, with a balanced portfolio adjusting for inflation each year. In most of those periods, in most of them, the portfolio ran out of money before the retirement was over. Keep in mind, this does not mean early retirement is inherently dangerous. It means 4% is the wrong number for early retirement. And the difference between the wrong number and the right number plays out over 5 decades. That is not a difference you can course correct easily once you are 10 or 15 years in. And this is why I love looking at the actual historical data rather than repeating the rule at face value. Once you see the numbers laid out across different time horizons, the conversation becomes completely different. It is not be a bit more conservative. It is the rule you have been given was calibrated to a retirement you are not planning to have. So let's go deeper into the research. Because the 68% headline number becomes significantly more useful once you understand the mechanics behind it. Specifically, what is actually driving retirement failure over long horizons. The most comprehensive work on long horizon withdrawal rates has been done by Wade Pfau. His historical simulations run across rolling multi-decade periods extending back to the 1870s, a considerably broader data set than the 1926 starting point that Bengen used. And what his research, along with complementary work from Kitces and Blanchett, consistently identifies is this. The primary driver of long-run retirement failure is not average market returns across the full retirement. It is the sequence of those returns. Specifically, what happens in the first 5 to 10 years. And here's the key, because this is different from what most people intuitively expect. You might assume that if the market averages 7% annually over your 40-year retirement, the arithmetic will work out. The average is reasonable, so the outcome should be fine. But that is not how a retirement funded by ongoing withdrawals actually functions. If the market falls 30% in years 2 and 3, and you are withdrawing 4% of an already shrinking portfolio, you are selling a larger number of shares to generate the same dollar income. And those shares are gone. When the market recovers in years 4 and 5, those shares are not in your portfolio participating in the rebound. The damage is permanent and asymmetric. Average returns later in the retirement cannot fully repair what early withdrawals from a damaged portfolio take away. What Pfau's research shows is that the retirements that failed historically were not always the ones that started in the worst markets. Some began in conditions that looked, in hindsight, quite ordinary. What they shared was a damaging sequence of returns in the early years, 2 or 3 consecutive difficult years, combined with a withdrawal rate that did not flex in response. That combination, bad early sequence plus rigid withdrawal, was the decisive factor in most historical failures. For early retirees, this problem compounds on 2 separate dimensions. First, the exposure window is larger. The critical early years, the period when sequence risk is most damaging, represent a larger share of a longer retirement. There is more time in which a bad sequence can strike before the plan has had the chance to build meaningful buffer. Second, the duration of the compounding damage is greater. Whatever portfolio deficit a bad early sequence creates, a 50-year retirement carries that deficit for far longer than a 30-year retirement does. The math has more time to work against you before longevity resolves the question. It's not just sequence risk, it's sequence risk multiplied by time. And that is the combination that explains most of the difference between 30-year and 50-year failure rates. So what does the research say the right number actually is? Pfau's work places the historical safe withdrawal rate for a 40-year retirement at approximately 3.5%. For a 50-year retirement, that drops to around 3.25%. And in his more recent research, incorporating forward-looking return expectations rather than relying purely on historical averages, that figure moves toward 3% or slightly below in some scenarios. These are not conservative estimates chosen for rhetorical effect. They are what the data produces when you apply Bengen's own methodology to the retirement lengths that early retirees actually face. So before we get into exactly what to do with this number in practice, if you're not already subscribed and you're finding this useful, it takes about 2 seconds, and it means you will see the next video when it goes live. Anyway, let's keep going because the next part is where the practical framework actually comes together. Everything I have walked through so far is grounded in historical backtesting. And historical data is the most rigorous tool we have for stress testing a withdrawal strategy, because it forces the approach to survive not just average conditions, but the actual worst-case sequences that real markets have produced across more than a century of data. But historical data has one inherent limitation worth naming clearly. It tells you what happened in past markets. It does not directly tell you what is most probable in the specific market environment you are actually retiring into today. And in 2026, the forward-looking context adds a meaningful layer to this conversation. Here's the thing about starting valuations. When you retire into a period of elevated stock market valuations, the expected forward returns over the following decade are systematically lower than the long-run historical average. This is not a speculative or controversial claim. It is a mathematical relationship that Pfau and Kitches have both written about extensively, and that Morningstar incorporates directly into their annual safe withdrawal rate analysis. By several standard valuation measures, U.S. equity markets in 2026 remain elevated relative to long-run historical norms. That does not mean a correction is imminent or that equities are the wrong place to be. What it means is that the return environment you are starting your retirement in is likely less favorable than historical averages assume. And a withdrawal rate calibrated to historical average returns carries more embedded risk than it appears to, because those average returns include decades of starting conditions that were more favorable than today's. Morningstar's most recent safe withdrawal rate research, for a retiree with a 30-year horizon and a moderately balanced portfolio, suggests using a rate closer to 3.7 to 3.8%, accounting for current expected returns rather than relying on the historical average, that is for 30 years. For a 40 or 50-year retirement beginning in the current environment, the forward-looking adjustment pushes the number lower still. Keep in mind, none of this changes the fundamental structure of the analysis. The historical backtesting is still the primary reference point, and the forward-looking adjustment is a layer of additional context rather than a replacement for the data. But it does reinforce the same conclusion that the backtested research reaches independently. For early retirees in 2026, the 3 to 3.25% range is not a pessimistic number. It is the number that accurately reflects both the historical record and the current environment you're retiring into. Here's the thing about how safe withdrawal rate research is typically communicated. The number gets framed as a ceiling, a hard constraint you must never exceed, and that framing generates a specific kind of anxiety because it implies that any spending above 3.25% in a given year is a violation of the plan. That is not what the research is actually saying, and being precise about this distinction matters practically. A safe withdrawal rate describes a specific, rigid strategy. You set your initial withdrawal at that percentage of your starting portfolio. You adjust that dollar amount upward for inflation each year. You do not reduce it in bad markets. You do not increase it in good ones. It is a fixed real dollar amount, sustained indefinitely. The historical success rates, 95% for 30 years, dramatically lower for 50, are the success rates of that rigid strategy. They are not the success rates of a retirement where you are spending thoughtfully and making calibrated adjustments as conditions evolve. Now, here's what changes when you're willing to build flexibility into the approach. And this is where work by Kitches and by financial planners Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger has been genuinely important. If a retiree is willing to make modest, calibrated spending adjustments, reducing spending by around 10% in a year where the portfolio has dropped materially, then the initial withdrawal rate that achieves the same long-run success level can be meaningfully higher than the rigid model supports. Some flexible spending frameworks allow starting withdrawal rates closer to 3.5 to 3.75% for 50-year retirements, because the built-in flexibility absorbs a portion of the sequence risk that the rigid strategy has to price in from the very first year. It's not just the starting number, it's the system wrapped around that number, and those two things are inseparable. So when I say the real number for early retirees in 2026 is in the 3 to 3.5% range, I'm not saying every year of your retirement will be constrained by that figure. I am saying that starting there and building a responsive framework around it gives you a retirement foundation that is genuinely robust. It is one where the math holds up historically, even in the worst sequences, and one where good markets create real headroom rather than being an invitation to overspend early and create fragility later. So let me walk through what this actually looks like in practice, because I want to move this from a number on a page to a framework you can use. Step number 1, Set your starting withdrawal rate based on your actual retirement horizon, not the conventional 30-year default, meaning if you are retiring at 45, your planning horizon is approximately 50 years. The research-supported starting rate for a rigid strategy is around 3.25%. If you're building a flexible framework with explicit guardrails, you can reasonably start at 3.5%. If you are retiring at 55, your horizon is approximately 40 years. The historical data supports a starting rate of 3.5% on the rigid model. With built-in flexibility, you can move toward 3.75%, and if you're retiring at 62 or 63, your horizon is closer to 35 years. The historical data supports a rate of 3.65 to 3.8%, depending on portfolio allocation and how much spending flexibility you're incorporating. This is the zone where the 4% rule begins to produce a defensible, though still elevated, failure rate, and where a modest adjustment meaningfully changes the probability picture. These are not arbitrary figures. They are what the backtested data produces when you match the withdrawal rate to the actual retirement length, rather than defaulting to the 30-year assumption that Bengen's original research was built around. Step number 2, build the guardrails. Here's how this works. You establish an upper withdrawal rate guardrail and a lower withdrawal rate guardrail around your starting rate, calculating your withdrawal rate in any given year as the dollar amount you're withdrawing divided by the current value of your portfolio. If your portfolio has grown significantly and your current withdrawal rate has drifted well below your starting rate, you give yourself permission to increase spending. The plan has headroom. You use it intentionally. That is not recklessness. That is the plan working exactly as designed. If the portfolio has declined and your current withdrawal rate has drifted meaningfully above your starting rate, you make a modest reduction. Typically, this is around 10%. You do not abandon the plan. You do not panic. You make a calibrated temporary adjustment that gives the portfolio time to recover without permanently impairing the long-run strategy. And this is truly why I love the guardrails framework for early retirees specifically. It is not asking your portfolio to absorb every conceivable market scenario through rigid arithmetic alone. It builds a feedback loop into the plan, a mechanism that allows a retirement to breathe through different market environments without collapsing. It converts a fragile rule into a resilient system. Step number 3, align your portfolio allocation with your actual time horizon. Here's something that may be counterintuitive. For very long retirements, 40 to 50 years, the conventional wisdom about progressively shifting toward bonds as you age may actually undermine your plan. Pfau and Kitches have both written about what they call a rising equity glide path. The idea is that for long horizon retirees, there is a meaningful case for starting retirement with a slightly more conservative allocation in the early years, when sequence risk is at its highest and the most damage can be done. And then you gradually increase equity exposure as the critical sequence risk window passes. It is the inverse of the standard glide path model. And for a 50-year retirement, it deserves serious consideration rather than being dismissed as an anomaly. Let me restate the core of what we have covered, because I want the bottom line to land clearly. The 4% rule is not wrong. It is misapplied. It was designed and validated for a 30-year retirement, and for that specific purpose, it holds up well across the historical record. But when you extend the horizon to 40 or 50 years, which is the actual territory that early retirees are working in, the same rule produces a failure rate that makes it genuinely unsuitable as a planning foundation. The real number for early retirees, based on what the back-tested research shows, is in the range of 3 to 3.5%, varying with your retirement horizon and the flexibility of your spending strategy. And given where we are starting from in 2026, the forward-looking case for using the lower end of that range is real and worth taking seriously. Now, here's the part I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most important piece of this entire conversation. A lower withdrawal rate is not a smaller life. A 3.25% starting rate does not mean your retirement is diminished or constrained. What it means is that your retirement has a meaningfully higher probability of lasting as long as you do. And the difference between a retirement plan that runs out of money at 82 and one that holds up at 95 is not a mathematical abstraction. It is the difference between financial security in the final chapter of your life and a situation that is genuinely frightening and extraordinarily difficult to recover from. It's not just math, it's resilience. It's the ability to spend with confidence rather than with anxiety. It's the difference between a plan built on a number that was never calibrated to your situation and a plan built on what the data actually shows for people like you. People who have done the saving, done the investing, done the hard work, and who deserve a framework that is truly built for the retirement they are planning to live. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing as we navigate through these crazy times.